Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream presented by podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Dennis MacDonald. Today we'll be discussing the synoptic problem. Does the synoptic problem exist? Is it real? Is it really a problem that needs to be solved? So Dennis, tell us, does the synoptic problem, is it really something that needs to be solved? Or is it, in your view, an illusion and not really as problematic as it might appear?
Oh, no, it's not an illusion. And it actually is a problem that was recognized already at the beginning of the 2nd century. One could say that Matthew already has a synoptic problem because he has the Gospel of Mark and another source, which scholars have called Q, and I'll come back to that later. It actually is one of the most important and long-standing problems in the history of Western religion. The synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that is in their canonical but not chronological order, are clearly related to each other in a literary way. But sometimes Matthew has material that's more primitive than Mark, and sometimes it has material that relies on Mark. The same thing's true of Luke. So we have to do some excavation to find out how these texts relate to each other, and if there are any missing pieces of the puzzle, such as scholars have suggested for multiple sources or the single source Q. In my view, all of those solutions are problematic. And yes, there is a synoptic problem, but I really do think that the methodology I'm advancing and have promoted now for 20 years, called the Q plus Papias hypothesis, will solve the synoptic problem. But the problem is going to be to get people to read my books, including my synopses of Epic Tragedy and the Gospels, and a book that's now forthcoming and should be out fairly soon, called Must the Synoptics Be a Problem? And my answer to that is no, they needn't be a problem. But yes, they have been a problem. And in order to excavate the lost gospel that resides between the lines of the synoptic gospels, I want to start with some general observations. We should be perfectly comfortable with the connection of the canonical synoptics as having this order: Mark first, then redacted by Matthew, and then coming last is Luke. And there's a debate among scholars about whether Luke knows Matthew or only Mark. Now, once I've said that, there are going to be lots of flags from some who would say, no, Matthew is the earliest. Some would say a version of Luke known to Marcion was earlier. Some would say, no, there's a missing source behind Mark and John, so that that document is going to be the earliest. So you've had this quest for the earliest gospel. Now, the earliest synoptic gospel almost certainly is Mark. But we know that there were lost gospels, and we have attestation of these lost gospels already near the end of the 1st century, but certainly by the beginning of the 2nd. For example, Papias, according to Eusebius, the historian, has 3 Greek gospels. One likely is our Gospel of Mark. Another is likely our Gospel of Matthew. But he's got another Greek gospel attributed to Matthew, and he thinks these 2 Matthews were translations, though botched translations, of Matthew's original Hebrew gospel. Now, that solution is no longer credible for anyone. But the fact that Papias and his informant, the elder John, had a document that looked like Matthew, but now is lost, it ought to raise our eyebrows. Also, at the beginning of Luke's gospel, he talks about many people, poli is the Greek word, who have attempted to write a narrative of things that have happened among them. And I think the evidence is pretty clear that among those many documents is Mark, Matthew, Papias' exposition, and I would suggest the lost gospel also that the elder John and Papias knew. There was another document, apparently a lost commentary, that was called Expositions of the Lord's Logoi. And the likely title, as we'll get to, of the lost gospel behind the synoptics was the Logoi of Jesus. So it's not impossible that this Aristion wrote a commentary on the Q document, which is really a fascinating but somewhat speculative conclusion. But we do know that there were lost gospels, and we have some idea of why they did not survive. In fact, the Gospel of Thomas was known of, but not discovered until the 20th century. So there we have the discovery of a lost gospel, and others have the Gospel of Judas, may be another example. It probably is. And there are others as well. So here's the basic problem of what's going on in these Gospels. Okay, we get the order of Mark, Matthew, Luke. Matthew and Luke are redacting Mark. But they share content with each other that doesn't appear in Mark. So they couldn't have gotten it from there. Now, they could have gotten it from multiple sources. They could have gotten it from oral tradition. But it's material that has a coherent ideology and social identity that is different from Mark, such that scholars, that is the International Q Project or advocates of the two-document hypothesis, with which I, for a long time, associated, thought must come from a lost gospel that's different from Mark. And what they tried to do then is to erase from Matthew and Luke all evidence of Markan corruption or influence, to see if they could tease out of the rest of the materials in the Gospels the same kind of material that we find in the Matthew-Luke overlaps against Mark. Now, that was a worthwhile project, but it was severely problematic. One problem, of course, is that we don't have physical remains of such a document, though it is likely, but we do know that there were lost gospels. And we'll talk about how scholars recover lost gospels in a moment, or lost text, ancient texts of any kind. So, but now it appears that Luke must have known Matthew and actually knows Papias, and Papias was obsessed with getting the Matthew chronology of Jesus's life in the correct order. So you can't simply assume that when you have Matthew-Luke overlaps, you can prefer one over the other with more primitive reading, what we call oscillating or alternating primitivity. Sometimes Matthew's more primitive, sometimes Luke is. The second problem is the assumption that Mark does not know that document. But even the reconstruction of Q by trying to avoid Markan interference has dozens of verses that are identical, almost identical in the two documents. Now, how does that happen? And we can see that in what are called doublets and avoided doublets or non-doublets. I won't go into that. It's very complex. And by the way, the reason the synoptic problem hasn't been solved, it is unbelievably complex. But I do think I found the right trowel for excavating the hill, and I think we can find the lost gospel. But the trick is a principle of reversed priority. So if we know that Matthew is imitating or redacting Mark, what do we do with passages where Matthew has a doublet, he has a second version of it that's more primitive? And what do we do with Luke? Luke is clearly redacting Mark. I think he's redacting Matthew as well. But why is it that when he has doublets, the doublets that are non-Markan are always more primitive? In other words, in some cases, Luke is prior to Mark. And Mark was written some 50 years earlier. Now, what do we do with that kind of information? That's why we have a synoptic problem. We can arrange the Gospels in one way, and when we scientifically look at them, the later documents are sometimes earlier than the sources. And I think by focusing on those reversed priority examples, we come up with a coherent and a beautiful document. Now, there's another problem with the history of the synoptic problem. That is a universal dismissal of the notion that the gospel authors are imitating Greek poetry, especially the Homeric epics. And the synoptic problem can't be solved and will never be solved if one doesn't recognize the influence of Homer on the Gospel of Mark in particular, but also Luke. It will not happen. Because when you see how that imitation works, you can remove that layer of composition from the Gospels and discover underneath it an original painting by a Jewish fan of Jesus of Nazareth, who is constructing his own narrative as an imitation of Deuteronomy to portray Jesus as the promised prophet like Moses. And if I'm right about my reconstruction of this document, it is the earliest and, in my view, the most attractive and compelling reference to the historical Jesus that we have. And I'm not suggesting anybody build a theology on that. I myself am an atheist. So I'm a philologian. I'm just trying to understand how these texts work and where they come from. But that is, I think, the best solution that we have. Now, one more issue of clarity. I know that people have dismissed my work, especially on social media, by saying that since we don't have a document called Q in our witnesses, obviously Q comes from the German word Quelle, meaning a source. And since we don't have any physical fragments of it, at least that we know of, it doesn't exist. I think that's a very unfortunate and a short-sighted understanding, because we have lots of lost books in antiquity, and I'll say something about how we reconstruct them. But they don't, so they don't like the notion of a lost gospel. Well, there certainly was a lost gospel. That's the best explanation we have for the synoptic problem. Unfortunately, and this is tragic in my view, because the people involved in this project have been, and I can still consider them to be, close friends. The Q that people know is is a tragedy. It is not the Q I talk about. My Q it develops out of different criteria altogether. It is much longer. It is a coherent book. It contains narrative. It is much more like Mark than we usually think. So I'm caught in a bind between others who advocate for a Q-like document, which I would consider my logo of Jesus to be Q-like, but it is not Q. So some people denied that there's a lost gospel at all, in which case I take the side of the two document hypothesis. Yes, there was a lost gospel. We know there were lost gospels, and it's the best solution we have to the synoptic problem. But damn it, the Q that is out there is not reliable. It is built on flawed criteria. Now, let me say just something about how classicists and others reconstruct lost books. And we know there are lots of them. If we have testimonia that suggests that there's a lost book, or that we have similarities in texts that suggest some kind of literary connection, we take a good look at those texts in their original languages and in other languages if they're associated with that document. And we create then what are called editions of those texts and assess those editions by certain criteria. Then we compare those editions and manuscripts to each other and develop criteria for determining which of those readings is most likely to appear in the original. And some of those, the best criteria that we have are called internal criteria. What can we say about the likelihood that one reading would have been lodged in an earlier document as opposed to its other reading? So classicists have known about how to do this project a lot. And many Christian apocryphal texts, Gospels and Apocryphal Acts, have to be reconstituted by just such measures. But when it comes to the Bible, or the New Testament in particular, people get squeamish about then using those same criteria or those same procedures with attending criteria in order to discover that book. And that's where we are with the synoptic problem. We have people who deny the existence of a source and therefore, in my view, make it impossible ever to solve the synoptic problem. Almost all scholars, apart from myself and a few others, think that the gospel, that the authors of the Gospels were ignorant of classical Greek poetry. That is a huge problem, and the synoptic problem will never be answered without two keys. One is a recognition of Homeric influence on the Gospels, the synoptics in particular, and also a recognition that there was a lost gospel and we need to use criteria to unearth it. But both of those criteria are under assault. And I know that I'm not going to be able to solve the synoptic problem for my scholarly friends while I'm alive. I can only do the best I can in articulating this alternative. And I'm not suggesting that my reconstruction is word for word what was in that lost gospel. It is very much more like an advance, a pioneering advance by using different criteria to see what we can establish about that text. My guess is that it's really quite close, and it certainly is closer, in my view, of course, but it certainly is closer than what one would find in any previous reconstruction of the lost gospel that calls itself Q or something like Q. So that's where we stand. And I know that that is complex. I know it sounds like a Jeremiad against my own guild, but the discovery of Homer and of alternative reconstructions of Q are simply inconvenient truths. that the guild and the church, if it wishes to, needs to understand if it's going to solve this problem.
And how does understanding Homeric use taking place in Mark and Luke, like Mark and Luke utilizing the text of Homer, how does that help solve the synoptic problem exactly?
Oh, that is a terrific question. It does so in many ways, but two in particular. One is if you compare certain stories, let's say the story of Jesus stilling the storm, or the Gerasene demoniac, or the frothing demoniac, or whatever, where you have the death of Jesus. You can compare those stories with Homeric stories, and in every single case, no exceptions, the Markan version is closer to the Homeric than the redactions of Mark by Matthew and Luke. So it helps to establish the Markan priority. That's one thing. Another that it does is once you establish Markan priority and you can see this indebtedness to classical Greek poetry, you can scrub Mark with a scouring pad and get rid of the Homeric layer, and underneath it find a very different text where the problem is not with the chief priests in Jerusalem, it's with Pharisees in Galilee. All of the Q document was written from Galilee, although it had allergies to what was going on in Jerusalem. It's really in a Galilean environment. When you get to Mark, the center of his narrative energy is in Judea, especially in Jerusalem, because of the death of Jesus, but even more so because of the Jewish war that devastated the temple. So those are the two ways that Homer helps most. First, it establishes once and for all the priority of Mark among the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John. There should be no doubt about that. The second is it allows one to see two different and very significantly polemical levels between what one finds in Logoi and its critical reconstruction or rewriting in Mark, so that you can get rid of the Greek mythological layer and discover a Jewish internecine squabble about Jewish law, about whether Jesus is the compassionate prophet like Moses, and so on. So those are the two primary ways that Homer helps.
Why do you think that Matthew and Luke omitted some information from Mark, like take the mention of the blind man at Jericho? Mark names him Bartimaeus, but Matthew and Luke don't utilize that. They seem to omit the name of the person. The reason I ask that question is that some people think that Matthew and Luke have what looks like, and I know you talked about this earlier too, that Matthew, and I suppose Luke too, would have sometimes what would look like in their whole reverse priority situation, sometimes stuff that's more primitive than Mark. Is there any evidence? Have you seen any compelling evidence for multiple layers of redaction in Mark, or do you think that most likely the autographed Mark looks practically the same as the one we have today?
Well, you're asking very good questions, and answers to them always will be somewhat conjectural. So let me go there. In my view, the issue of reverse priority never occurs in narrative. And the case that you have of blind Bartimaeus is an interesting example. Now, people might want to say that Mark adds the name Bartimaeus, a son of the honored one. It's kind of a hybrid between Aramaic and Greek. But it's likely that Matthew and Luke just didn't see the usefulness of the name. But this story that we have of the blind man who throws off his mantle, his himation, and jumps up, and Jesus heals him, almost certainly is an imitation of what one reads in Odyssey chapter 11 about blind Teresius, the seer. And I've written this up many times. It appears in my synopses of epic tragedy in the Gospels. But Odysseus goes to the netherworld. He needs to find out from the blind seer Teresius how best to sail home and what to do when he gets there. Bartimaeus does not need to drink the blood in the pool in order to recognize Odysseus, even though he's blind. In other words, he's been given gifts of cognition that the sighted people don't have. He is known to have been, in Greek mythology, bisexual. And so when he appears in art, he's bearded, but he's wearing a himation over his head, same word that's used in Mark, over his head, like a veil to indicate that he is bisexual. He at first was male and then became female, had a child, and then returned to being male. And this became, he became a center for bisexuality, a icon of bisexuality in the ancient world, one might say. But Odysseus leaves Teresius in Hades, still blind, whereas Jesus can take Bartimaeus along with him into Jerusalem, but now healed. So it's what the Greeks called Syncreases. That is, Odysseus leaves the blind seer in Hades. Jesus can take a blind seer along with him toward the cross. So it's a good mimetic parallel. There should be really no question about it when one looks at the evidence, in which case then Bartimaeus is a part of the mimetic project. Matthew and Luke come along and they like the Bartimaeus story, but they don't see the significance of the name. They also don't talk about the removal of the himation. So these elements are part of the original story in Mark, and then they get removed.
And how does suggesting that Luke knew Matthew help us further solve the synoptic problem?
Well, it actually makes it harder in one way. It would be nice when we find Matthew-Luke overlaps without Mark, simply to say sometimes Matthew is more original and sometimes Luke is more original. That would be an easier game to play, and it's the play that the project of the two document hypothesis people. But if Luke knows Matthew, then, as the FAR hypothesis advocates suggest, you could say that those overlaps are not coming from Q. Luke knows Matthew, so he's just redacting Matthew. And Luke is a very clever author. He can do so freely that you wouldn't know that he's redacting that document. And there is actually some truth to it. So in my view, Matthew-Luke overlaps are most useful when you can show that Luke is more primitive than what you have in Matthew. And then you can take that to the bank, even though Matthew knows the Q document or whatever we want to call it. I call it the Logoi of Jesus. It's most likely original title. Or it can be called Q plus because of its length. But so that's one of the things that makes it more difficult. On the other hand, by saying that Luke knows Matthew and Mark, it makes his reverse priority to those documents all the more spectacular. If we date Mark, let's say, to the year 75, and let's say that Luke is written, let's say 40 years later or so, around 115. How is it that Luke has more primitive material than in Mark? It's not oral tradition. It's not memory. It's not people who are still alive telling him what really happened. That's all bunk. It rather is he's got a document that is earlier than Mark. And Mark knows it, and he's the one who does the changes on the document. So by having the sequence, Mark, Matthew, Luke, which conforms to the Homeric imitation pattern, then when you carefully compare Luke with Mark or Matthew, whatever, you can see that he's got more primitive material. Come on, where's he getting that? Well, he's obviously getting it from a document or multiple documents.
Is there any evidence at all for any additional lost gospels if you suspected that there might be any additional ones that may not even be in the Q plus Papias diagram? Or do you think that you've pretty much got all of them squared away?
That, again, is a very interesting question, and I have to answer it in two ways. One is, it certainly is conceivable that there were other sources that, and we mean by sources not oral tradition, we're talking about documents, that circulated that we don't know about. So that's a possibility. And I would be open to evidence for their existence. In my view, there isn't any. If one takes a look at some commentaries, let's say, I won't mention names, but a commentary on the Gospel of Mark, people imagine, because of a kind of source criticism run riot, dozens of lost sources, little pieces of information. That is also bunk. You have to show some cohesiveness and why these people were writing and how that these texts connect to each other. And I think this idea of a proliferation of gospels is really a kind of a backdoor, unmerited, unproven way of thinking that everybody in that period was interested in Jesus. They were trying to write down everything they could remember about him. They were trying to get down, every saying he said, and they must have been, circulating in multiple forms and, little chits of paper or papyri over here and, a scroll over there or whatever. It's just really preposterous. Now, there may have been lost texts, but there were not lots and lots and lots of them. That just assumes that Jesus was a rock star. And I don't think the evidence supports that. I think you have these people who have found in Jesus's teaching some wisdom, and they crafted these documents. So if one can show me evidence for more gospels, I would be as excited as anybody about them. I just don't think that we have them. By the way, I want to express a pet peeve that I have for the media and much of social media, but not you or Derek or others who have invited me to talk. That pet peeve is what I call the golly gee whiz holy Jesus Bible land syndrome. As long as somebody says, "Ooh, I found a scrap 2 inches wide of the Gospel of John, whoopee, that proves that Jesus is the Christ," or whatever, and the media just swallow it hook, line, and sinker. when many of these are late pieces of papyri, some of them are questionable, and many of them have been proven to be forgeries. But when you have scholars like those of the International Q Project or myself, or even from other perspectives, who are trying to solve the synoptic problem and come up with what I consider to be important and viable solutions to handling one of the greatest losses in the history of ancient religion, namely the Q document, the media are quiet. When's the last time you saw in the New York Times anybody talk about the synoptic problem or the discovery of Q? But they're going to be happy to give space to a disputed fragment that's 2 inches wide.
What do you make of secret mark? I don't know if I'm going too off topic by asking about that, because it kind of relates to the question I asked earlier about the possibility of different versions of Mark having existed. Do you think secret mark could have been one of those, or do you think that's a modern fake?
It's a forgery. I don't think there can be any doubt about it, but I know that some scholars are still maintaining that there's something there. No, there isn't. Actually, I had a debate with Morton Smith about that when I was teaching in New York for a while. And one of his students told me that I killed him because 2 weeks later he was dead. No, I didn't kill him, and I don't take responsibility for that. And I don't know if his heart failure had to do with, but I showed him, and among other scholars, that the story of the naked young man in Mark is a Homeric imitation of Velpenor. And it has nothing to do with the kind of adventurous interpretation that Morton Smith was giving to the text. And I think other scholars have shown on other grounds that it was a masterful, clever, skillfully worked out forgery. And I'm as sure about that as I am the names of my children.
Speaking on the Gospel of Mark, I know that you say, and also the Q plus Papias diagram, that Mark is aware of the Q document. And Mark doesn't seem to be quoting Q very much in his text, and law scholars try to say, well, when Mark has something from the double tradition that is in Matthew and Luke, that's also in his text, but it's rare. There's only a few verses in there. They'll say, well, Mark got that from oral tradition, and the lack of extensive quotation of Q in Mark suggests that Mark did not know Q directly. What do you make of that?
That's bunk too, honestly. And I don't know how much time you want to put to this. The extent of overlaps between Mark and Q, as it's reconstructed in the critical edition of Q, is enormous. So much so that there's a branch of Q speculation that goes back at least 100 years and includes scores of scholars who held to the existence of Q and also insisted that Mark must have known about it because of these doublets. Furthermore, Jacob, all of Mark's parallels to the Q document are secondary, and you can prove that they're secondary. There are some where it's difficult to assess because the wording is so identical. But the notion that Mark doesn't quote Q very often really is not paying attention to the data. And if one says that, one of the things that is so amazing about Mark is that he imitates the Homeric epics and then he inserts a saying from Q. A good example of one of my favorites, but I can give you dozens of them, honestly. Jesus's triumphal entry. He's going into the temple, and the crowds are saying, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." That appears identically in Matthew and Luke, without an other apparent parallel to Mark. And therefore, these people, the Q people, say, "Oh, it must have been in Q." But if it's in Q, Mark knows it. And it's exactly the same wording, and it's in Jerusalem, and the Q saying happens just before a curse on the temple. Come on, how does that work? Another example would be there are passages. Mark has his own version of the Beelzebul controversy. It's very close to what one finds in Q reconstructions, but it leaves out a few things. He leaves out the business about binding the strong man in the same way. He leaves out the notion that the demons can come back and re-inhabit a victim and bring 7 others with them. But those things appear then in Mark when he's telling the story of the frauding demoniac, which begins with a mute demoniac being cured, which is what happens at the beginning of the Beelzebul controversy. You have the statement at the end. When the demon is exorcised, he's forbidden to return back into his victims. In the Gerasene demoniac story, one finds this business about no one can bind the strong man who's coming out of the caves. So Mark has very cleverly gone through the Q smorgasbord and put together an amazing meal. But these pieces from the smorgasbord belong in the same smorgasbord that Matthew and Luke were using later. And so the notion that Mark doesn't imitate the logo of Jesus very much is, I think, demonstrably wrong. And I can show that in this book. I have 3 different appendices that show the extent of Matthew Q overlaps, many of which are embedded in his Homeric imitations. If you're interested, I could give you a few others.
Yeah, I like that.
Okay, let's see. We did the, let's see. Actually, I should pull up my screen so I can, just a minute, I'm gonna, oh, I know where, just a minute, I can get it this way.
Sure, take your time.
Okay. Okay, here's one. At Jesus' baptism, a heavenly voice declares that Jesus is the Son of God. But only Jesus knows it, according to Mark, but also in at least my reconstruction of Q, and it's in other reconstructions as well. The metamorphosis of Jesus before his disciples, which we call the Transfiguration, is an imitation of Odysseus's transformation or metamorphosis before his son Telemachus, in which he declares to Telemachus that he is actually his father, returned after 20 years, and that he's not to tell anybody about it because the suitors will kill him if they discover what's going on. So Jesus reveals his identity to the disciples, and a heavenly voice says, and it's basically a quotation from the baptism, "This is my beloved son, listen to him." And the word beloved son is the word that Homer uses for Telemachus. It's Penelope's beloved son. And then Jesus says, well, don't tell anybody about this, because if my opponents learn it, they'll kill me. That's the assumption. And so we have an imitation of Homer, but we also have a replication of this saying, that you are my son, that this is my beloved son. Well, I have so many that it's hard for me to know which one. Oh, here's one. In virtually every version of Q, you find a reference to Jesus scolding his opponents for not having believed in the teaching of John the Baptist. So, but that appears in Matthew, Luke overlaps, but it doesn't appear in the Gospel of Mark, at least in most ways. But it does appear in a passage where Jesus is in Jerusalem and he's talking to the chief priests. And he said, they asked, well, tell us who you are and under what authority you're casting people out of the temple. And Jesus says, and by the way, I want to ask you a question. Was the baptism of John the Baptist from heaven or not? And it puts them on their heels. And so then they basically are quoting from the Q document. Well, if we say it's from heaven, he'll say, well, why didn't you believe in it? It's the same words that are used in the Q document. But if we say it is not, we fear the people. They're going to be in an uproar because they consider Jesus a prophet. Same word that's used in the Q document. Here's another one that's wonderful. In all reconstructions of Q, at the end, Jesus promises thrones to the disciples. You will sit on 12 thrones in the kingdom, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So that doesn't appear in Mark, but it can't appear in Mark. He's not fond of the disciples. One of them betrays Jesus, and another denies him 3 times, and they all flee at his arrest. He dies alone. The disciples in Mark are untrustworthy and cowardly. So what does he do with this business about the thrones? Jacob, or James and John, the sons of Zebedee, come to Jesus and they say, hey, we want you to do something nice for us and to give us something. And Jesus says, well, what is that? And, well, we want to sit one on your right side and one on your left in your glory. In other words, they want to play the role of the Dioscuri, the other sons of thunder, Castor and Polydeuces, who have special arrangements from Zeus about the afterlife. And Jesus says, no, I'm not going to guarantee that. The throne, the seats at my right and left hand are going to be there for martyrs. Now, you will be martyred, but the priority of sitting on my right and left hand, that's for somebody else. And unless you're martyred, you may not have a throne at all, and the thrones aren't numbered. So here you have Mark's argument against the Q document over the thrones going to the disciples. Now that can't be an accident, Jacob. I can probably find another example or two, but I think those are pretty good. That you see the parallels that Mark has with classical Greek poetry. And he sometimes uses poetry to tarnish what he sees in the Logoi of Jesus.
Okay, we got a super chat. Donnie Springer, thank you for your super chat. Is there any evidence the sayings or discourses were ever written in Aramaic, or just paraphrased in Greek with no written sources when translated?
We don't have any evidence of anything about Jesus written in Aramaic from the beginning. We don't have evidence of it. Now, one could say Papias thinks that there was a Hebrew or Aramaic Hebrew Matthew, and the elder John thought so too. But they don't have that document, and they use that document as a hypothetical in order to explain the differences between the two Greek Matthews they had. Now, Donnie, I want to back off just a tad to say that there are lots of Aramaic equivalents in the Q document and in the synoptics. Gehenna is one. Amen is one. Sabbath is one. Let's see. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani in Mark is, and you get puns. I mentioned before, Bartimaeus means the son of the esteemed one, probably. There are other possibilities, but it certainly is Aramaic and Greek. And also Bar Abba, the name of Barabbas, is the son of the father, which is a word play to put him over against the Son of God, namely Jesus at his trial. So we do have a bilingual environment for these early texts. And in some cases, the puns require the reader to be bilingual too. So there is a Greek Aramaic environment for the early Jesus movement. Whether Jesus himself could speak Greek, I'm not willing to say, though many have suggested that he did. But that's a great question. I wish I had a better answer for you. I don't think we have any evidence of anything written in Aramaic about Jesus from that early period, but we certainly have Aramaic influence.
JM, thank you for your super chat and the thumbs up. Do we have any idea at all what Aristian's Diegesis, his logia, actually looked like, besides what we're briefly told about him in the writings of Papias?
No, we don't. But what we have is really very interesting. One is simply his date. His date probably is somewhere in the 1st century. So it's earlier than the Gospels of Luke and John, almost certainly, because even Papias doesn't know about them. The other is that the title of his work is Diegesis of the Logoi of the Lord. When Luke writes his preface, he mentions that many people have written Diegesis of about things that have happened in his world. And he ends by telling Theophilus that I want you to have assurance about the interpretation of the logoi you have been taught. The same word is used. So the logoi of Jesus is likely the title of the lost gospel because it's an imitation of Deuteronomy. And the beginning of Deuteronomy in Greek is, these are the logoi that Moses spoke in the wilderness, basically as a rebuke to Israel before he dies. So the other is that Eusebius says that throughout these 5 volumes of the expositions, Papias sprinkles information that he got from John the Elder, traditions from John the Elder, but from the expositions of the Logoi of the Lord by Aristian. In other words, Papias thought it was a worthwhile contribution to information about Jesus. And he puts it on the par of the Elder John. And because it's a Diegesis, it likely was a written book. Now, it could be a written book about Jesus' sayings that are circulating orally. That's possible. But the correlation between the titles of these books is really quite fascinating. And the title of Papias's work is not a Diegesis, it's exegesis. It's an exegesis of the Logia about the Lord, very similar in the title. And in both, Diegesis also has the root ego, the agesis, the hegemai in it. So the words are very similar. So I wish we knew more about it. I certainly do. I think maybe it vanished because it was a commentary on a book that was not canonical.
When in the 1st century CE do you think Aristian most likely wrote? Do you think it's in the mid, somewhere in circa 50 or maybe circa 80 or 90 CE?
Well, there's no way to know. There's no way to know. Papias, apparently, according to Eusebius, thought that Ristian and the Elder John were still alive when he was collecting. He says they were still alive when he was collecting lore about Jesus from them. So it means that they weren't writing very early. They at least they lived until let's say the end of the 1st century. If they knew Jesus at all, they would have had to have been youngsters. But there's no way of knowing when it was written. I would say this, though. If we say that the Logoi of Jesus had to have been written shortly before the Jewish War, obviously Aristian's got to be writing after that. So my guess is it may be more or less contemporary to Mark and Matthew, but that still is conjecture.
And do you think that either Mark or Matthew knew his Diegesis, or neither?
I don't think any of the synoptics knew the document. I don't see evidence for that. But if Luke knows Papias, he knows about Aristian. And that's why he can say many have tried to do this thing. And he may not have seen Aristian's text, but he knows that that was yet another attempt. And it was a Diegesis. It was an exegesis.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Dennis.
Well, it's always a pleasure, Jacob. I trust this was helpful.
Oh, I thought it was. Thanks again.
Okay.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.